Hello, good morning. We're going to pick up with our next reading session, starting here, page 27, section 3, going to, I don't know. We've been doing a good amount of reading. I'm sure we can get to 47 at least. All right. 3. Regarding the discussion of Benjamin's theory of art. In his essay, The Work of Art in the Age of Technical Reproduction, Walter Benjamin uses the concept, the loss of aura, to describe the decisive changes art underwent in the first quarter of the 20th century, and attempts to account for that loss by changes in techniques of reproduction. Since up to this point we have derived the conditions for the possibility of the self-criticism of art from the historical unfolding of art, institution, and content of works, we need to discuss the suitability of Benjamin's thesis, which explains these conditions as the direct result of changes in the sphere of productive forces. Benjamin's point of departure is a certain type of relation between work and recipient, which he refers to as marked by the presence of an aura. What Benjamin means by the concept of aura could probably most easily be rendered as unapproachability, the unique phenomenon of a distance, however close it may be. The aura has its origin in cultic ritual, but for Benjamin, the mode of reception marked by the presence of aura remains characteristic also of the no longer sacral art that has developed since the Renaissance. It is not the break between the sacral art of the Middle Ages and the secular art of the Renaissance that Benjamin judges decisive in the history of art. Rather, it is that break that results from the loss of aura. Benjamin traces this break to the changes in techniques of reproduction. According to him, reception characterized by the presence of aura requires categories such as uniqueness and authenticity. But these become irrelevant to an art, such as the film, for example, whose very design entails reproduction. It is Benjamin's decisive idea that a change in reproduction techniques brings with it a change in the forms of perception, and that this will result in a change in the character of art as a whole. The contemplative reception of the bourgeois individual is to be supplanted by what is the simultaneously distracted and rationally testing reception of the masses. Instead of being based on ritual, art will now be based on politics. We will first consider Benjamin's construction of the development of art, then the materialist explanatory scheme he proposed, the period of sacral art during which it is an integral part of ecclesiastical ritual, and the period of autonomous art that develops along with bourgeois society and that detaches itself from ritual, creating a specific type of perception, the aesthetic, are summarized by Benjamin in the concepts of art with an aura. But the periodization of art he proposes is problematic for several reasons. For Benjamin, art with an aura and individual reception, absorption in the object, go hand in hand, but this characterization applies only to autonomous art, certainly not to the sacral art of the Middle Ages. The reception of the sculpture on medieval cathedrals and the mystery plays was collective. Benjamin's construction of history omits the emancipation of art from the sacral, which was the work of the bourgeoisie. One of the reasons for this omission may be that with the l'art pour l'art movement and aestheticism, something like a re-sacralization or re-ritualization of art did in fact occur. But there is no similarity between this reversion and the original sacral function of art. Art here is not an element in an ecclesiastical ritual within which a use value is conferred on it. Instead, art generates a ritual. Instead of taking its place within the sacred sphere, art supplants religion. The re-sacralization of art that occurred in aestheticism thus presupposes art's total emancipation from the sacral and must under no circumstances be equated with the sacral character of medieval art. To judge Benjamin's materialist explanation of the changes in modes of reception as a result of changes in reproduction techniques, it is important to realize that he sketches a second explanation, which may prove to have greater explanatory efficacy. The artists of the Avant-Garde, especially the Dadaists, he writes, had already, before film was discovered, attempted to create film-like effects by the means used in painting. Quote, the Dadaists attach much less importance to the sales exchange value of their work than to its uselessness for contemplative immersion. Their poems are a word salad containing obscenities and every imaginable waste product of language. The same is true of their paintings, on which they mounted buttons and tickets. What they intended and achieved was a relentless destruction of the aura of their creation, which they branded as reproductions with the very means of production. End quote. Here, the loss of aura is not traced to a change in reproduction techniques, but to an intent on the part of the makers of art. The change in the overall character of art is no longer the result of technological innovation, but mediated by the conscious acts of a generation of artists. To the Dadaists, Benjamin ascribes only the role of precursors. They create a demand that only the new technical medium can satisfy. But there's a problem here. How is one to explain this pioneering? Differently expressed, the explanation of the change in the mode of reception by the change in reproduction techniques acquires a different place value. It can no longer lay claim to explaining a historical process, but at most to being a hypothesis for the possible diffusion of a mode of reception that the Dadaists were the first to have intended. One cannot wholly resist the impression that Benjamin wanted to provide an ex post facto materialist foundation for a discovery he owed to his commerce with avant-gardist art, the discovery of the loss of aura. But such an undertaking is problematic for the decisive break in the development of art, which Benjamin fully grasps in its historical significance, would then be the result of technological change. A direct link is established here between emancipation or emancipatory expectation and industrial technique. But although emancipation is a process that can certainly provide a field of new possibilities for the satisfaction of human needs, it cannot be conceived of as independent of human consciousness. An emancipation that occurs naturally would be the opposite of emancipation. At bottom, Benjamin is attempting to transfer from society as a whole to the partial sphere that is art, the Marxist theorem according to which the development of the productive forces shatters the production relations. The question arises whether this transfer does not ultimately remain mere analogy. In Marx, the concept productive forces refers to the technological level of development of a given society and includes both the means of production as objectified in machines and the workers' capacities to use these means. It is questionable whether a concept of artistic productive forces can be derived from this idea, because in artistic production, it would be difficult to subsume under one concept the capacities and abilities of the producer and the stage of development of the material productive forces and reproductive techniques. So far, artistic production has been a type of simple commodity production, even in late capitalist society, where the material means of production have a relatively minor bearing on the quality of the product. They do, however, have significance as regards its distribution and effectiveness. That, since the invention of film distribution techniques have affected production in turn, cannot be doubted. The quasi-industrial techniques whose dominance in certain areas is a result of this fact have proved anything but shattering, however. What has occurred is the total subordination of work contents to profit motives, and a fading of the critical potencies of works in favor of a training in consumer attitudes, which extends to the most intimate interhuman relations. Brecht, in whose threepenny lawsuit, we hear echoes of Benjamin's theorem concerning the destruction of art and its aura by new reproduction techniques, formulates more cautiously than Benjamin, quote, This apparatus can be used better than almost anything else to supersede the old kind of untechnical, anti-technical glowing art with its religious links, end quote. In contrast to Benjamin, who tends to ascribe emancipatory quality to the new technical means, film, as such, Brecht emphasizes that certain possibilities inhere in the technical means, but he suggests that the development of such possibilities depends on the way they are used. If, for the reasons mentioned, it is a problematical undertaking to transfer the concept of productive forces from the sphere of overall social analysis to that of art, the same holds true of the concept of production relations, if only because, in Marx, it unambiguously refers to the totality of social relations that govern work and the distribution of the products of work. But with art as an institution, we have previously introduced a concept that refers to the conditions under which art is produced, distributed, and received. In bourgeois society, the salient characteristic of this institution is that the products that function within it remain relatively free from any pressure that they serve social purposes. It is Benjamin's achievement to have defined, by the concept of aura, the type of relation between work and recipient that evolves in the institution of art in bourgeois society. Two essential insights come together here. First, that it is not in and of themselves that works of art have their effect, but rather that this effect is decisively determined by the institution within which the works function. Second, that modes of reception must be based in social history. The perception of aura, for example, in the bourgeois individual. What Benjamin discovers is form as a determinant in art, in the sense Marx uses the concept. Here, we also have what is materialist in his approach, but the theorem according to which reproduction techniques destroy art that has an aura is a pseudo-materialist explanatory model. A final comment regarding the matter of periodization in the development of art. Above, we criticize Benjamin's periodization because he blurs the break between the medieval sacral and modern, secular art. Given the break between art with and without aura as elaborated by Benjamin, one arrives at the methodologically important insight that periodization in the development of art must be looked for in the sphere of art as institution, not in the sphere of the transformation of the content of individual works. This implies that periodization in the history of art cannot simply follow the periodization in the history of social formations and their phases of development, but that it must be the task of a science of culture to bring into view the large-scale changes in the development of its subject. Only in this way can cultural science make an authentic contribution to the investigation of the history of bourgeois society. But where that history is taken as an already known reference system and used as such in the historical investigation of partial social spheres, cultural science degenerates into a procedure of establishing correspondences. The cognitive value of such an enterprise must be rated as small. To summarize, the historical conditions for the possibility of self-criticism of the social subsystem art cannot be elucidated with the aid of Benjamin's theorem. Instead, these conditions must be derived from the disappearance of that tension that is constitutive for art in bourgeois society, the tension between art as institution, autonomy status, and the contents of individual works. In this effort, it is important not to contrast art and society as two mutually exclusive spheres. For both, the relative insulation of art from demands that it serve purposes and the development of contents are social phenomena determined by the development of society as a whole. If we criticize Benjamin's thesis according to which the technical reproducibility of the work of art imposes a different mode of reception, one marked by the absence of aura, this does not mean that we deny the importance the development of techniques of reproduction has. But 2 points must be made. Technical development must not be understood as an independent variable, for it is itself dependent on overall social development. Second, the decisive turn in the development of art in bourgeois society must not be traced monocausally to the development of technical reproduction techniques. With these two provisos, one may summarize the importance that technical development has for the evolution of the fine arts in these terms. Because the advent of photography makes possible the precise mechanical reproduction of reality, the mimetic function of the fine arts withers. But the limits of this explanatory model become clear when one calls to mind that it cannot be transferred to literature. For in literature, there is no technical innovation that could have produced an effect comparable to that of photography in the fine arts. When Benjamin understands the rise of l'art pour l'art as a reaction to the advent of photography, the explanatory model is surely being strained. L'art pour l'art theory is not simply the reaction to a new means of reproduction, however substantially it may have promoted the tendency toward the independence of the fine arts, but is the answer to the tendency in fully evolved bourgeois society for works of art to lose their social function. We characterize this development as the loss of the political content of individual works. There is no intent to deny the significance that changed techniques of reproduction had for the development of art, but the latter cannot be derived from the former. The evolution of art as a distinct subsystem that began with l'art pour l'art and was carried to its conclusion in aestheticism must be seen in connection with the tendency toward the division of labor underway in bourgeois society. The fully evolved, distinct subsystem art is simultaneously one whose individual products tend to no longer take on any social function. By way of a general formulation, it is probably impossible to safely go further than this. The process by which the social subsystem art evolves into a wholly distinct entity is part and parcel of the developmental logic of bourgeois society. As the division of labor becomes more general, the artist also turns into a specialist. This trend, which reaches its apogee in aestheticism, has been most adequately reflected by Validity. Within the general tendency toward ever-increasing specialization, it may be assumed that various subsystems impinge on each other. The development of photography, for example, affects painting, withering of the mimetic function, but such reciprocal influences among social subsystems should not be given excessive weight. Although important, especially in explaining non-synchronies in the evolution of the various arts, they cannot be made the cause of that process in which the various arts generate what is specifically theirs. That process is a function of the overall social development to which it belongs and cannot be adequately understood by a cause-effect scheme. Pardon me. The self-criticism of the social subsystem art to which the avant-garde movements attained has been so far primarily in connection with the tendency toward the progressing division of labor that is so characteristic of the development of bourgeois society. The overall social tendency toward the articulation of subsystems and a concurrent specialization of functions are being understood as the developmental law to which the sphere of art is also subject. This completes the sketch of the objective aspect of the process. But how the evolution of distinct subsystems is reflected by the subjects must still be inquired into. It seems to me that the concept of a shrinkage of experience can aid us here. If experience is defined as a bundle of perceptions and reflections that have been worked through, it becomes possible to characterize the effect of the crystallization of subsystems resulting from the progressing division of labor as a shrinking of experience. Such shrinkage does not mean that the subject who has now become specialist in a subsystem no longer perceives or reflects. In the sense proposed here, the concept means that experience the specialist has in his partial sphere can no longer be translated back into the praxis of life. The aesthetic experience as a specific experience, such as aestheticism developed it, would in its pure form be the mode in which the shrinking of experience as defined above expresses itself in the sphere of art. Differently formulated, Aesthetic experience is the positive side of that process by which the social subsystem art defines itself as a distinct sphere. Its negative side is the artist's loss of any social function. As long as art interprets reality or provides satisfaction of residual needs only in the imagination, it is, though detached from the praxis of life, still related to it. It is only in aestheticism that the tie to society still existent up to this moment is severed. The break with society, it is the society of imperialism, constitutes the center of the works of aestheticism. Here lies the reason for Adorno's repeated attempts to vindicate it. The attention of the avant-gardist may be defined as the attempt to direct toward the practical, the aesthetic experience which rebels against the praxis of life that aestheticism develops. What most strongly conflicts with the means-end rationality of bourgeois society is to become life's organizing principle. All right, still not quite comfortable. All right, chapter 3, on the problem of the autonomy of art in bourgeois society. Epigraph. Its autonomy, that of art, surely remains irrevocable. It is impossible to conceive of the autonomy of art without covering up work. 1. Research problems. The two sentences of Adorno circumscribe the contradictoriness of the category autonomy. Necessary to define what art is in bourgeois society, it also carries the taint of ideological distortion where it does not reveal that it is socially conditioned. This suggests the definition of autonomy that will underlie the following comments and also serves to distinguish it from two other competing concepts: the autonomy concept of l'art pour l'art and the autonomy concept of a positivist sociology that sees autonomy as the merely subjective idea of the producer of art. If the autonomy of art is defined as art's independence from society, there are several ways of understanding that definition. Conceiving of art's apartness from society as its nature means involuntarily adopting the l'art pour l'art concept of art and simultaneously making it impossible to explain this apartness as the product of a historical and social development. If, on the other hand, one puts forward the view that art's independence from society exists only in the artist's imagination and that it tells us nothing about the status of works, the correct insight that autonomy is a historically conditioned phenomenon turns into its denial. What remains is mere illusion. Both approaches miss the complexity of autonomy, a category whose characteristic is that it describes something real, the detachment of art as a special sphere of human activity from the nexus of the praxis of life, but simultaneously expresses this real phenomenon in concepts that block recognition of the social determinacy of the process. Like the public realm, the autonomy of art is a category of bourgeois society that both reveals and obscures an actual historical development. All discussion of this category must be judged by the extent to which it succeeds in showing and explaining logically and historically the contradictoriness inherent in the thing itself. A history of art as an institution in bourgeois society cannot be sketched in what follows because the requisite preliminary studies in the arts and the social sciences have not been done. Instead, various approaches toward a materialist explanation of the genesis of the category autonomy will be discussed because this may lead to a clarification of both the concept and the thing. Also, concrete research perspectives can most readily be developed from a critique of the most recent studies. B. Hinz explains the genesis of the idea of the autonomy of art as follows, quote, "During this phase of the historical separation of the producer from his means of production, the artist remained as the only one whom the division of labor had passed by, though most assuredly not without leaving a trace. The reason that his product could acquire importance as something special, autonomous, seems to lie in the continuation of the handicraft mode of production after the historical division of labor had set in." End quote. being arrested at the handicraft stage of production within a society where the division of labor and the separation of the worker from his means of production becomes increasingly the norm, would thus be the actual precondition for seeing art as something special. Because the Renaissance artist worked principally at a court, he reacted feudally to the division of labor. He denied his status as craftsman and conceived of his achievement as purely intellectual. M. Mueller comes to a similar conclusion. Quote, "At least in theory, it is the court that promotes the division of artistic work into material and intellectual production, the field in which this happens between the art that is created there." Here, we have the significant attempt to advance a materialist explanation of intellectual phenomena that transcends the rigid opposition of bourgeoisie and nobility. The authors do not content themselves with merely attributing intellectual objectifications to special social positions, but try to derive ideologies, here the idea of the nature of the process of artistic creation, from social dynamics. They see the autonomy claim of art as a phenomenon that emerges in the feudal sphere, but that is a reaction to the change the early capitalist economy brings to courtly society. This nuanced interpretive scheme has its analog in the conception Werner Krauss gave of the honnête homme in 17th century France. The social idea of the honnête homme also cannot be understood simply as the ideology of a nobility that is losing its political role. Precisely because it turns against the particularism of the estates, Krauss interprets it as the attempt of the nobility to win the upper reaches of the bourgeoisie for its own struggle against absolutism. The value of the results of these studies in the sociology of art is qualified, however, because the speculative element, and this applies also to Mueller, dominates to such a degree that the thesis cannot be justified by the findings. Another factor is more decisive. What is referred to here by the concept autonomy is almost wholly the subjective side of the process in which art becomes autonomous, the object of the explanatory attempt of the ideas artists have about their activity, not the birth of autonomy as a whole. But this process comprises a second element, which is that of the freeing of a capacity for the perception and shaping of reality that had hitherto been integrated into cultic ends. Although there is reason to assume that the elements of the process, the ideological and the real, are connected, there is something problematical about reducing it to its ideological dimension. It is to the real side of the process that Lutz Winkler's explanatory attempt addresses itself. His point of departure is Hauser's comments that with the transition from the individual who commissions an artist to create something for a specific purpose to the collector who acquires the work of prestigious artists on the growing art market, the independently working artist makes his appearance as the historical correlate of the collector. Winkler draws these conclusions, quote, "The abstraction from the person who commissions a work and the work being commissioned, an abstraction which the market made possible, was the precondition for artistic abstraction, the interest in techniques of composition and coloring," end quote. Hauser is largely descriptive. He sets forth a historical development, the simultaneous appearance of the collector and the independent artist, that is, the artist who produces for an anonymous market. On this, Winkler bases an explanation of the genesis of the autonomy of the aesthetic. Such an elaboration of descriptive statements into an explanatory historical construct seems problematical to me, not least because other comments Hauser makes suggest different conclusions. Although artist studios were still places of handicraft in the 15th century, Hauser writes, and subject to guild rules, the social status of the artist changed around the beginning of the 16th century because the new seigneuries and principalities on the one hand, and wealthy cities on the other, became sources of an ever-increasing demand for qualified artists who are capable of taking on and executing important orders. In this context also, Hauser speaks of a demand on the art market, but what is meant is not the market on which individual works are bought and sold, but the growing number of important commissions. This increase resulted in a loosening of the guild ties of the artists. The guilds were an instrument of the producers by which they protected themselves against surplus production and the fall in prices this entailed. Whereas Winkler's derives artistic abstraction, the interest in techniques of composition and color, from the market mechanism, artists produce for the anonymous market on which the collector buys the works. They no longer produce for the individual who commissions something. An explanation that contradicts Winkler's could be deduced from the Hauser comments just given. The interest in techniques of composition and color would then be a consequence of the new social position of the artist, which results not from the decreasing importance of commissioned art, but from its growth. This is not the place to determine what the correct explanation may be. What is important is to recognize the research problem that the divergence of the various explanatory attempts makes apparent. The development of the art market, both of the old commission market and the new market where individual works are bought and sold, furnishes a kind of fact from which it is difficult to infer anything about the developing autonomy of the aesthetic. The process of the growth of the social sphere that we call art, which extended over centuries and was fitful because it was inhibited time and again by counter-movements, can hardly be derived from any single cause, even though that cause be of such central importance for society as the market mechanism. The study of Bredekamp differs from the approaches discussed so far because the author attempts to show, quote, that the concept and idea of free, autonomous art is tied from the very beginning to a specific class, that the courts and the great bourgeoisie promoted art as a witness to their rule, end quote. Because aesthetic appeal is used as a means of domination, Bredekamp sees autonomy as a delusion and contrasts it with non-autonomous art, which he considers a positive value. He tries to show that it was not out of an emotional conservatism that the lower classes clung to Trecento forms in the 15th century, quote, but because they had the capacity to experience and resist the process by which art develops from cult and then lays claim to autonomy as tied to the ideology of the upper classes, end quote. Similarly, he interprets the iconoclasm of the plebeian and petit bourgeois sects as a radical protest against the process by which sensuous appeal becomes something in its own right. For Savonarola certainly did not object to an art that tended toward moral instruction. In this type of interpretation, the principal problem is that it equates the interpreter's insight and the experience of those who lived through the event. The interpreter doubtlessly has the right to make attributions. On the basis of one's experience in and of society, one may tend to believe that the aesthetic conservatism of the lower strata contains an element of truth. But the interpreter cannot simply impute this insight to the petit bourgeois and the plebeian strata of 15th century Italy as their experience. That this is what Bredekamp does becomes clear once more at the end of his study, where he characterizes aesthetic religious art as an early form of partisanship and ascribes to it as positive attributes, quote, the denunciation of the aura of ascendancy and its abundance of art, the tendency toward receptibility by the masses, and the neglect of aesthetic appeal in favor of didactic and political clarity, end quote. Without meaning to, Bredekamp thus confirms the traditional view that engaged art cannot be genuine art. More decisive is the fact that because of his partiality to a moralizing art, Bredekamp fails to give due weight to what is liberating and the emancipation of aesthetic appeal from religious contexts. The divergence of genesis and validity must be taken note of here if one wishes to grasp the contradictoriness of the process by which art becomes autonomous. The works in which the aesthetic offers itself for the first time as a special object of pleasure may well have been connected in their genesis with the aura emanating from those that rule, but that does not change the fact that in the course of further historical development, They not only made possible a certain kind of pleasure, the aesthetic, but contributed toward the creation of the sphere we call art. In other words, critical science must not simply deny an aspect of social reality, and the autonomy of art is such an aspect, and retreat to the formulation of a few dichotomies: aura of the rulers versus receptibility by the masses, aesthetic appeal versus didactic political clarity. It must open itself to the dialectic of art that Benjamin summarized in the phrase, quote, "There is no document of civilization which is not at the same time a document of barbarism," end quote. Benjamin had no intention of condemning civilization with this phrase, an idea that would be at odds with his concept of criticism as something that saves or preserves. Rather, he formulates the insight that hitherto, culture has always been paid for by the suffering of those who are excluded from it. Greek culture, for example, was the culture of a slave-holding society. True, the beauty of works does not justify the suffering to which they owe their existence, but neither may one negate the work that alone testifies to that suffering. Although it is important to show what is suppression, aura of ascendancy, in the great works, they must not be reduced to it. Attempts to annul what is contradictory in the development of art by playing off a moralizing against an autonomous art miss the point because they overlook both what is liberating and autonomous and what is regressive in moralizing art. Compared with such undialectical reflections, Horkheimer and Adorno are correct when, in the dialectic of enlightenment, they insist that the process of civilization cannot be separated from suppression. The various more recent approaches toward the clarification of the genesis of the autonomy of art were not confronted with each other here, but not because such efforts should be discouraged. Quite the contrary, I believe that they are extremely important. Yet it is also true that such confrontation shows the danger of historical philosophical speculation. Especially a science that understands itself as materialist should be on guard against it. This is not meant as a call to blindly abandon oneself to the material, but as a plea for an empiricism that is informed by theory. This formula points to a concealed research problem that, to the best of my knowledge, materialist culture science has not yet clearly formulated, and that is, it certainly has not solved. What procedures can be devised for the attempt to solve certain technical problems such that the investigation of the historical material can yield results not already postulated at the theoretical level? As long as this question has not been asked, the cultural sciences always risk oscillating between bad concreteness and bad generalization. With reference to the problem of autonomy, one should ask whether there is a connection between its two elements, the detachment of art from the praxis of life, and the obscuring of the historical conditions of this process, as in the cult of genius, for example, and what sort of connection that may be. The emancipation of the aesthetic from the praxis of life could probably be most easily traced if one examined the development of aesthetic ideas. The nexus between art and the sciences that the Renaissance created would then have to be interpreted as the first phase of art's emancipation from ritual. In the emancipation of art from the direct tie to the sacral, one should probably see the center of that process that is so difficult to analyze because it requires centuries for its completion, the achievement of autonomy by art. The detachment of art from ecclesiastical ritual should undoubtedly not be understood as an unbroken development. Its course was contradictory. Hauser repeatedly emphasized that as late as the 15th century, the Italian merchant class still satisfied its needs for representation by commissioning sacral works. But even within what still had the external appearance of sacral art, the emancipation of the aesthetic proceeds. From the counter-reformers who used art for its effect paradoxically promoted its emancipation by their very action. It is true that Baroque art makes an extraordinary impression, but its connection with the religious subject has become relatively loose. This art does not derive its principal effect from the sujet, but from the abundance of colors and forms. The art that the counter-reformers intended to make a means of ecclesiastical propaganda can thus detach itself from the sacral purpose because the artist develops a heightened sense for the effects of colors and forms. There is yet another sense in which the process of emancipation of the aesthetic is a contradictory one. For as we have seen, what occurs here is not merely that a new way of perceiving that is immune to the coercion of means-end rationality comes into existence. It is also that the sphere thus this opens up is ideologized, notion of genius, etc. Concerning the genesis of the process, finally, it will undoubtedly be necessary to make its connection with the rise of bourgeois society the point of departure. It will have become clear that to prove such a connection, much remains to be done. Here, the first steps taken by the Marburg researchers into the sociology of art would have to be developed further. 2. The autonomy of art in the aesthetics of Conte and Schiller. So far, it has been the fine arts of the Renaissance that have served to give some idea of the prehistory of the development of the autonomy of art. Not until the 18th century, with the rise of bourgeois society and the seizure of political power by a bourgeoisie that had gained economic strength, does a systematic aesthetics as a philosophical discipline and a new concept of autonomous art come into being. In philosophical aesthetics, the result of a centuries-long process is conceptualized by, quote, the modern concept of art as a comprehensive designation for poetry, music, the stage, sculpture, painting, and architecture, which did not become current until the end of the 18th century, end quote. Artistic activity is understood as an activity that differs from all others. Quote, the various arts were removed from the context of everyday life and conceived of as something that could be treated as a whole, as the realm of non-purposive creation and disinterested pleasure. This whole was contrasted with the life of society, which it seemed the task of the future to order rationally, in strict adaptation to definable ends, end quote. With the constitution of aesthetics as an autonomous sphere of philosophical knowledge, this concept of art comes into being. Its result is that artistic production is divorced from the totality of social activities and comes to confront them abstractly. Whereas the unity of décolleté and prodesse had been a commonplace not only of all poetics since Hellenism, and especially since Horace, but also a fundamental tenet of artistic self-understanding, the construction of a non-purposive realm of art brings it about that in theory, prodesse is understood as an extra aesthetic factor, and that criticism censures as inartistic works with a didactic tendency. In Kant's Critique of Judgment, 1790, the subjective aspect of the detachment of art from the practical concerns of life is reflected. It is not the work of art, but the aesthetic judgment of taste, that Kant investigates. It is situated between the realm of the senses and that of reason, between the, quote, interest of inclination in the case of the agreeable, end quote, and the interest of practical reason in the realization of the moral law, and it is defined as disinterested. Quote, the delight which determines the judgment of taste is independent of all interest, end quote, where interest is defined by, quote, reference to the faculty of desire, end quote. If the faculty of desire is that human capability which makes possible on the side of the subject a society based on the principle of the maximization of profit, then Kant's axiom also defines the freedom of art from the constraints of the developing bourgeois capitalist society. The aesthetic is conceived as a sphere that does not fall under the principle of the maximization of profit prevailing in all spheres of life. In Kant, this element does not yet come to the fore. On the contrary, he makes clear what is meant the detachment of the aesthetic from all practical life contexts by emphasizing the universality of aesthetic judgment as compared with the particularity of the judgment to which the bourgeois social critic subjects the feudal lifestyle. Quote, if anyone asks me whether I consider that the palace I see before me is beautiful, I may perhaps reply that I do not care for things of that sort that are merely made to be gaped at. Or I may reply in the same strain as that Iroquois sachem who said that nothing in Paris pleased him better than the eating houses. I might even go a step further and inveigh with the vigor of a Rousseau against the vanity of the great who spend the sweat of the people on such superfluous things. All this may be admitted and approved, only it is not the point now at issue. All one wants to know is whether the mere representation of the object is to my liking. End quote. The quotation makes clear what Kant means by disinterest, both the interest of the Iroquois sacrum, which is directed toward the immediate satisfaction of needs, and the practical interest of reason of Rousseau's social critic lie outside the sphere Kant stakes out for aesthetic judgment. With his demand that the aesthetic judgment be universal, Kant also closes his eyes to the particular interests of the class. Toward the products of the class enemy also, the bourgeois theoretician claims impartiality. What is bourgeois in Kant's argument is precisely the demand that the aesthetic judgment have universal validity. The pathos of universality is characteristic of the bourgeoisie, which fights the feudal nobility as an estate that represents particular interests. Kant not only declares the aesthetic as independent of the sphere of the sensuous and the moral, the beautiful is neither the agreeable nor the morally good, but also of the sphere of the theoretical. The logical peculiarity of the judgment of taste is that whereas it claims universal validity, it is not a, quote, logical universality according to concepts, end quote, because in that case, the necessary and universal approval would be capable of being enforced by proofs. For Kant, the universality of the aesthetic judgment is thus grounded in the agreement of an idea with the subjective conditions of the use of judgment that apply to all, concretely in the agreement of imagination and understanding. In Kant's philosophical system, judgment occupies a central place, for it is assigned the task of mediating between theoretical knowledge, nature, and practical knowledge, freedom. It furnishes the concept of a purposiveness of nature that not only permits moving upward from the particular to the general, but also the practical modification of reality. For only a nature conceived as purposive in its manifoldness can be cognized as a unity and become the object of practical action. Kant assigned the aesthetic a special position between sensuousness and reason, and defined the judgment of taste as free and disinterested. For Schiller, these Kantian reflections become a point of departure from which he can proceed towards something like a definition of the social function of the aesthetic. The attempt strikes one as paradoxical, for it is precisely the disinterestedness of the aesthetic judgment and, it would seem at first, the functionlessness of art as an implicit consequence that Kant had emphasized. Schiller attempts to show that it is on the very basis of its autonomy, its not being tied to immediate ends, that art can fulfill a task that cannot be fulfilled any other way. The furtherance of humanity, the point of departure of his reflections, is an analysis of what, under the influence of the reign of terror of the French Revolution, he calls the drama of our period. Quote, among the lower and more numerous classes, we find crude, lawless impulses which have been unleashed by the loosening of the bonds of civil order and are hastening with ungovernable fury to their brutal satisfaction. The extinction of the state contains its vindication. Society uncontrolled, instead of hastening upward into organic life, is relapsing into its original elements. On the other hand, the civilized classes present to us the still more repugnant spectacle of indolence and a depravity of character, which is all the more shocking since culture itself is the source of it. The intellectual enlightenment on which the refined ranks of society, not without justification, pride themselves, reveal, on the whole, an influence on the disposition so little ennobling that it rather furnishes maxims to confirm depravity. End quote. At the level of analysis quoted here, the problem seems to have no solution. In their actions, the lower and more numerous classes are slaves to the immediate satisfaction of their drives. Not only that, the enlightenment of reason has done nothing to teach the civilized classes to act morally. According to Schiller's analysis, in other words, one may put one's trust neither in man's good nature nor in the educability of his reason. What is decisive in Schiller's procedure is that he does not interpret the result of his analysis anthropologically, in the sense of a definitively fixed human nature, but historically, as a result of a historical process. He argues that the development of civilization has destroyed the unity of the senses and of reason, which still existed among the Greeks. Quote, "We see not merely individual persons, but whole classes of human beings developing only part of their capacities, while the rest of them, like a stunted plant, show only a feeble vestige of their nature." End quote. Quote, "Eternally chained to only one single little fragment of the whole, man himself grew to be only a fragment. With the monotonous noise of the wheel he drives everlastingly in his ears, but he never develops the harmony of his being, and instead of imprinting humanity upon his nature, he becomes merely the imprint of his occupation, of his science." As activities become distinct from each other, a more rigorous dissociation of ranks and occupations becomes necessary. Formulated in concepts of the social sciences, this means that the division of labor has class society as its unavoidable consequence. But Schiller argues that class society cannot be abolished by a political revolution because the revolution can be carried out only by those men who, having been stamped by a society where the division of labor prevails, have for that reason been unable to develop their humanity. The aporia that appeared at the first level of Schiller's analysis as the irresolvable contradiction of sensuousness and reason reappears at the second, although the contradiction here is no longer an eternal but a historical one. It seems no less hopeless, for every change that would make society both rational and humane presupposes human beings who would need such a society to develop in. It is at precisely this point of his argument that Schiller introduces art, to which he assigns no less a task than to put back together the halves of man that had been torn asunder, which means that it is within a society already characterized by the division of labor that art is to make possible the development of the totality of human potentialities that the individual cannot develop in his sphere of activity. Quote, "But can man really be destined to neglect himself for any end whatever? Should nature be able, by her designs, to rob us of a completeness which reason prescribes to us by hers? It must be false that the cultivation of individual powers necessitates the sacrifice of their totality, or however much the law of nature did have that tendency, we must be at liberty to restore by means of a higher art this wholeness in our nature which art has destroyed." End quote. This is a difficult passage because the concepts here are not rigid but, seized by the dialectics of thought, pass into their opposite. And refers first to the limited task of the individual, then to the teleology, unfolding into distinct human powers, that occurs in and through historical development, nature, and finally to an all-around development of man that reason calls for. Similar considerations apply to the concept of nature that is both a law of development but also refers to man at a psychophysical totality. Art also means two different things. First, it refers to technique and science, and then it has the modern meaning of a sphere that has been set apart from the praxis of life, higher art. It is Schiller's idea that precisely because it renounces all direct intervention in reality, art is suited to restore man's wholeness. Schiller, who sees no chance in his time for the building of a society that permits the development of the totality of everyone's powers, does not surrender this goal, however. It is true, though, that the creation of a rational society is made dependent on a humanity that has first been realized through art. It cannot be our purpose here to trace Schiller's thought in its detail, to observe how he defines the play impulse, which he identifies with artistic activity as the synthesis of sense impulse and form impulse, or how, in a speculative history, he He seeks to find liberation from the spell of sensuousness through the experience of the beautiful. What is to be emphasized in our context is the central social function that Schiller assigns to art precisely because it has been removed from all the contexts of practical life. To summarize, the autonomy of art is a category of bourgeois society. It permits the description of art's detachment from the context of practical life as a historical development, that among the members of those classes which, at least at times, are free from the pressures of the need for survival, a sensuousness could evolve that was not part of any means-ends relationships. Here we find the moment of truth in the talk about the autonomous work of art. What this category cannot lay hold of is that this detachment of art from practical to context is a historical process, i.e., that it is socially conditioned. And here lies the untruth of the category, the element of distortion that characterizes every ideology, provided one uses this term in the sense that early Marx does when he speaks of the critique of ideology. The category autonomy does not permit the understanding of its referent as one that is developed historically. The relative dissociation of the work of art from the praxis of life in bourgeois society thus becomes transformed into the erroneous idea that the work of art is totally independent of society. In the strict meaning of the term, autonomy is thus an ideological category that joins an element of truth, the apartness of art from the praxis of life, and an element of untruth, the hypostatization of this fact, which is a result of historical development as the essence of art.